In this section, we discuss the Cold War, the years between 1945 and 1952, essentially what's happening in the world after World War II ends. In this photograph, we see representations of the big three countries. Here we have Churchill representing the United Kingdom, we have Truman representing the United States in the middle, and on the right we have a very rare depiction of a smiling Joseph Stalin representing the United Soviet Socialist Republic. And they are meeting at Potsdam in Germany between July 17th and August 2nd, 1945. And here they discuss the immediate surrender of Japan and terms of post-war peace and organization, which we're going to be looking at within this section. So the United States emerged from World War II, so between 1939 and 1945, as the world's greatest power, and almost most of the army was demobilized. The country boasted one of the most powerful navy and air force. World War II created an international interdependence that no one could ignore. Thus, the Roosevelt administration refused to retreat back into isolationism as what happened in World War I, and it was believed that the United States could lead the rest of the world into a future of international cooperation, expanding democracy, and increasing living standards across the world. We see the same rhetoric being repeated up to this day. Now, at this point, the United States accounted for more than half the world's manufacturing capacity, and it alone had the atomic bomb. However, most people realized that the war had actually pulled them out of the Depression, and it wasn't the New Deal. So what would happen once the war ended? This was on the mind of FDR and his cabinet, and before the end of the war, they made plans to establish United States dominance over the post-war global economy. Remember, the United States had not been affected by the war as the European nations, who were devastated again. So in July 1944, representatives from all 44 Allied countries met at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, and they established the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is now known as the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, which were expected to rebuild war-ravaged Europe. The IMF worked to stabilize currency exchange rates and stop currency conflicts and trade wars, issues that had plagued the 1930s and led to the development of fascist governments and socialism and the popularity of communism. The United States was the main supplier for funds for the IMF and the World Bank, and they gave more than $7 billion to this effort and had a huge influence in shaping other economies. The USSR participated, but they actually refused to ratify the agreements because they believed that the IMF and World Bank would turn the USSR into a capitalist colony of the West. And so from this point on, we see the USSR and its satellites becoming economically isolated from the rest of the world. Now, after World War II ended, we see many European nations, new nations, being carved out of the remains of Hitler's Third Reich. Hitler had expanded Germany, creating this living room, taking over Eastern European lands, and pushing the Slavic nations either further east or subjugating them as enslaved peoples. But what happened after World War II ended, we have massive amounts of displaced people, so-called DPs, and huge populations during World War II were actually moved to various areas, and so people were essentially homeless, and it's millions and millions of people. And so in the 10 years after World War II, these people were repatriated to either new countries that had been developed or to other areas. And what we see is that Europe became very much divided along ethnic lines, whereas pre-World War II, European populations had been mixed, and countries were a hodgepodge of various ethnic groupings. And now Europe became actually divided, more homogeneous in certain countries, and divided along racial, ethnic lines. And this has led to the conflicts that we see today. If you remember back to the 1990s, the Serbia and Bosnia war that occurred there. So the Atlantic Charter of 1941 had declared the rights of all nations to self-determination, and they renounced claims to new territories as spoils of war, as what happened in World War I. But note, the rights of self-determination did not apply to countries in the third world like Africa and Asia. So the new nations were pretty much European nations, and this leads later to a lot of issues. For example, the Vietnam War. So what happened? The Atlantic Charter was not followed by FDR, and it actually divided Europe into spheres of influence. So he recognized that other countries like the USSR had their own spheres of influence, and believed that through economic incentives, such as United States aid, that other countries in Eastern Europe would not follow the USSR. However, Stalin was pretty much insecure. They'd been invaded by Germany, and so he was determined to re-establish the borders of the USSR to what they were in 1941. However, he ended up annexing eastern Poland and a few other Baltic nations, creating this buffer state between the USSR and the West, and also ended up spreading Soviet ideology. So it became a huge worry to the West that Stalin was going to create this communist empire encompassing all of Europe. So at the Potsdam Conference, that picture we saw earlier, the wartime allies met to decide what to do with Germany. So what do you do with Germany? In this case, Germany was clearly the aggressor. Unlike the kind of gray area that had happened in World War I, as who was to blame for the war, Hitler was definitely the cause, and so there was no controversy there. So after much deliberation in July 1946, it was decided to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, and each zone would be governed by one of the Allies. So we see France, USSR, England, and the United States overseeing these zones. The USSR and France argued against reunification because they felt that Germany would become strong again, so they were trying to prevent a stronger Germany. And so these two countries had actually borne the brunt of Germany's aggression, and so they really did not want Germany to be rebuilt. They were against that. Stalin actually wanted very heavy reparations, and he wanted to limit Germany's reindustrialization. But the other countries had seen what happened after World War I, and so they actually they were hesitant to be as heavy-handed with Germany as they had been in World War I. Now, FDR, who'd actually worked very well and could negotiate with Stalin, he died, and Truman took over. FDR had managed to create a trust with Stalin, and when Truman took over, he didn't like Stalin at all, and the feeling was mutual. Now, Truman envisioned that a rebuilt Germany, a reunified Germany, could be used as a balance in power to the USSR, and it would actually serve as a buffer here, limiting Soviet expansion into Western Europe, and it would be a strong market for the United States and British goods. So by December 1946, the British and the US merged their zones, and this actually served to put the US against the USSR, so we see an increasing division here. Now, Plans for the security of the post-war world were put into place during a conference at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. in 1944 and again in April in 1945 in San Francisco. So what they decided to do here was completely scrap the League of Nations. It had not worked, but they didn't give up on that idea, and they created, out of the ashes of the League of Nations, the United Nations. Now, this was envisioned as a global organization that would arbitrate disputes amongst member nations and prevent future wars from happening by force. So what they decided to do was give the United Nations teeth, and so it could be followed by military action if necessary. So out of the 50 original countries that signed the United Nations Charter and vote in the Assembly, only 5 could be on the Security Council: the United States, Great Britain, the USSR, France, and China. The Security Council was responsible for maintaining international peace and security, and we see references to the Security Council in dealings with Syria, trying to figure out if the United Nations should send force and how they should go about it. And then we had the USSR and China unwilling to send in troops, and then that threw a wrench in the works there. But anyway, the United States was very successful in its humanitarian efforts and protecting human rights, and they were responsible for repatriation and creating camps for displaced people directly after World War II. However, what we see happening was that the balance of power was held by Western nations, and they ended up controlling membership into the United Nations, and this polarized certain groups, and it landed up making East-West negotiation settlements almost impossible. Now, it also became more apparent that the USSR was not going to cooperate with the West, and it was becoming more and more isolated. In March 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech saying, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent, the European continent." He called on the United States to join in an alliance with Great Britain and act vigorously to stop Soviet expansion. The United States was a little hesitant to go completely along with Winston Churchill because they're still watching Great Britain closely, but they did react to this challenge, and so they created a policy which unites military, economic, and diplomatic strategies into containing communism. So it was recognized you couldn't stop communism, but you could keep it from spreading. So the word contain becomes very, very important. And this ideology became an issue of freedom versus slavery. So we hear that rhetoric being thrown around. So the whole goal was to create economies with free markets, because so through free market capitalism, essentially, you create the strong economy, and then you create a very strong middle class, because having a strong middle class was seen as a way of having strong stability, and so you would have a political stability, which would create economic stability, and in doing that, you would have the communist ideologies couldn't flourish in a strong capitalist economy, and you would have peace. And we see the same kind of idea being followed with radical Islam and the push to create free market economies in other parts of the world. So had Roosevelt lived, we see that relations with the United States and the USSR may have been pretty different. So, as I said earlier, FDR had a fairly good relationship with Stalin, and they had cultivated a certain amount of trust. But actually, a lot of critics had felt that FDR was a little too soft on Stalin, and so once FDR died, we had Truman taking over. And FDR had not really liked Truman very much, and he kept him in the dark about everything. And so Truman was a novice in the diplomatic arena, and he actually lacked FDR's experience. But in attempting to keep FDR's vision, he attempted to be conciliatory towards the USSR, but with increasing pressure from the anti-Soviet lobby, he became tired of babying the Soviets, and he adopted a more harsher stance towards the Soviets. In February 1946, George Kennan, a diplomat to the USSR, he sent what's known as the Long Telegram, 8,000 words, from Moscow, detailing his views on the Soviet Union and US policy towards this communist state. Now, Kennan's analysis provided one of the most influential underpinnings for Americans' Cold War policy of containment. Now, this lengthy memorandum began with the assertion that the Soviet Union could not foresee permanent peaceful coexistence with the West. And they had this neurotic view of world affairs, and it was a manifestation of this instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. And he said that as a result, the Soviets were deeply suspicious of all nations and believed that their security could only be found in patient but deadly struggle for total destruction of rival power. Kennan was convinced that the Soviets would try to expand their sphere of influence, and he pointed to Iran and Turkey as the most likely immediate trouble areas. In addition, Kennan believed that the Soviets would do all they could to weaken power and influence of Western powers on colonial, backward, or dependent peoples. So that's a very important observation there. And he said that fortunately, the Soviet Union was impervious to logic of reason, but it was highly sensitive to the logic of force. Therefore, it would back down when strong resistance is encountered at any point. Now, the United States and its allies, he concluded, would have to offer that resistance. Kennan's telegram caused a huge sensation in Washington. Stalin's aggressive speeches and threatening gestures towards Iran and Turkey in 1945 and 46 led the Truman administration to decide to take a tougher stance and rely on the nation's military and economic muscle rather than pursue diplomacy in dealing with the Soviets. The turning point came when a civil war in Greece created an atmosphere friendly to the rise of communist groups. Great Britain informed the United States they had a cash crunch and they couldn't afford to financially support an anti-communist government, and they were going to withdraw aid. Truman believed that without the U.S. aid, Greece and other countries around it, like Turkey and even the oil-rich Middle East, would fall to communism. So Congress approved $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey to crush all left-wing communist rebels. At home, Truman's anti-communist crusade helped boost his slumping popularity. This act, the $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey, became known as the Truman Doctrine. Here, it was believed that the United States had a right to intervene to save other countries from communism and safeguard the free will through economic and political measures, although they were willing to consider military measures. George C. Marshall, who was a former general and Secretary of State, he formulated the European Recovery Program, a complement to the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan was designed to reduce hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos, and to restore the confidence of the European people in the economic future of their own countries and Europe as a whole. It also sought to turn back left-wing socialist and communist influence in Western Europe, plus boost the United States economy by securing the European market for American goods. The Marshall Plan cost around 12% of the federal budget but much of the aid was in the form of American goods made by Americans. Along with this plan, the United States and 17 other Western European countries ratified a tariff-cutting agreement, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Pact, also known as GATT. This was later renamed the World Trade Organization. The Marshall Plan, however, created a greater divide between the United States and the USSR. Stalin denounced the plan as an American scheme to rebuild Germany and incorporate it into an anti-Soviet bloc. Within the Western-occupied Germany, a common currency was established. Stalin responded in June 1948 by blocking off all access to the western zones of Berlin that was deep inside Soviet territory. This created a huge crisis, as food and fuel could not get into West Berlin. With the help of the Royal Air Force, the United States organized Operation Vittles. Operation Vittles was an around-the-clock, 24/7 airlift of supplies to West Berlin. Over 2 million tons of goods were dropped off 24 hours a day for 7 days a week for almost a year before Stalin lifted the blockade in May 1949. This was a huge victory for Truman. So after the crisis, Western Germany was merged into a single nation of the Federal Republic of Germany, and the USSR created the German Democratic Republic on the east side, so we have Germany divided in half between the east and the west. The US reaction to the Berlin crisis made many other non-communist European countries want to join in a defensive alliance against the USSR. In April 1949, 10 European nations, Canada and the US, formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in a mutual defense agreement. NATO was a complement to the Marshall Plan and deepened the divide between the US and the USSR. Later in the 50s, when NATO allowed a rearmed West Germany to join, the USSR countered by creating the Warsaw Pact that included East Germany. So here we see the world essentially divided into two parts, the NATO countries and the Warsaw Pact here. The success of the containment policy depended on the United States' ability to monopolize atomic weapons. After 1945, the US began to stockpile atomic weapons and test them on deserted islands. However, this monopoly was challenged in August 1949 when the Soviet Union tested their own atomic bomb. This began an arms race where the US and USSR were building increasingly bigger and more powerful bombs, and this signaled the beginning of the Cold War. Truman's aggressive, gutsy personality suited the confrontational mood of the Cold War, and Truman set out to enlarge the New Deal, but he ended up only settling on modest domestic agenda to promote social welfare and an anti-isolationist, anti-communist foreign policy, and this became known as Cold War liberalism. Truman was not prepared to be a president, and he was overwhelmed in the first year of his presidency. He had many challenges in the post-war world. At home, he was dealing with major economic issues. There was a huge black market for consumer goods, people boycotted stores, workers were striking and wanted better wages, and employers were determined to slash wages. Truman tried to introduce new programs. His 21-point program to create housing assistance, unemployment compensation, higher minimum wages, and a national health insurance was beaten down in Congress, but they ended up passing a watered-down Employment Act of 1946. The Republicans took advantage of the situation, and they won majorities in both the House and Congress. One of the first things they did was to ratify the 22nd Amendment that limited the president to 2 terms. All worker gains from the New Deal era were done away with. And we see the Taft-Hartley Act outlawed the secondary boycott, in other words, sympathy strikes, and the use of union dues for political purposes. It mandated an 80-day cooling-off period and required all union officials to swear that they were not communists. Truman may have supported the ideal of the New Deal, but he removed most of the holdovers from FDR's team by 1946. One of the most progressive, Henry Wallace, fired as Secretary of Agriculture for urging conciliation with the Soviets, made plans to run against Truman for president. While branding Wallace a communist stooge, Truman also attacked do-nothing congressional Republicans. So to cut Wallace's lead on civil rights, Truman issued executive orders in 1948 in July, desegregating the armed forces and banning discrimination in the civil service. So pretty much with the South as good as lost, and popular New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey heading the Republican ticket, Truman appeared hopelessly far from victory. So as the election neared, Gibbon Harry campaigned vigorously and managed to revive the New Deal coalition. By election time, Truman had deprived Henry Wallace of nearly all his liberal support. Truman won the popular vote by a margin of 5% and trounced Dewey 303 to 189 in the Electoral College, while Democrats took back Congress. It was a huge personal victory for Truman, but one he was unable to translate in popularity or political success. Truman hoped that Democratic congressional majorities would enable him to expand the New Deal with a fair deal announced in his 1949 State of the Union address. But a powerful bloc of conservative Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans turned back his agenda. Congress passed a National Housing Act in 1949, promoting federally funded construction of low-income housing. Otherwise, Truman made very little headway. And federal anti-lynching law outlawing the poll tax and prohibiting discrimination in interstate transportation all failed, along with the proposals to repeal the Taft-Hartley Act and an attempt to introduce national health insurance. The Fair Deal promoted economic growth, not the reapportionment of wealth or political power, as the proper mechanism for ensuring social harmony and national welfare, establishing a democratic Cold War liberalism for decades to come. To encourage productivity at home, Truman focused on foreign trade rather than domestic innovations. Equally important, he reshaped liberalism by making anti-communism a key element in both foreign policy and domestic agenda.